All right, so cave metaphor part 3. Now, if you recall, in the cave metaphor, we had 4 levels of reality. You had 1, 2, and then outside the cave, 3 and 4. And you had the thing in itself, T-I-I, thing in itself. Then you had the image of T-I-I. Then you had the thing, and then you had the image of the thing. Okay, and then if you recall, essentially the dichotomy between the two parts of the cave was the world of the visible and the world of the intelligible. Okay, I want to give you an example of what we could mean by these various levels of reality. Take the concept of justice. So, if we're talking about justice, this would mean that there are 4 levels of justice going on simultaneously. And the trick is, one can understand higher levels of justice the more one moves ultimately toward this reality, right? As we move here towards enlightenment, we have higher, more universal understanding of justice. So, take this. The image of the thing. So the lowest level of justice, the lowest level of reality in our culture, I would say something like Judge Judy. So when it comes to Judge Judy is sort of related somewhat to justice, but as you know, it's a television show, and the point of all television shows is to entertain people. So, is there some grain of truth in Judge Judy? Sure. But the way she judges her judge, notice we use judge in several different ways, right? On one level, a judge weighs evidence and uses his or her judgment to decide what is a just course of action. But then we also use the word judge in a different sort of way, and sometimes we mean, rather than judge, to sort of use our biases on. So you could judge someone in this sense of judge not lest ye be judged, and say, oh, that person's wearing shabby clothes, so they're a bad person. That's not the kind of judge we mean. For now, we're thinking of judging in terms of what a judge should do. And a judge is someone who is supposed to be unbiased, who is supposed to add up the evidence and decide what is the fairest way to move forward. So a judge should not then make decisions based on his or her own preferences. Judge Judy, if you've ever watched the show, yells at these people and, I'm going to give that guy a piece of my mind. But a true judge is supposed to be impartial and rational. So anyway, the point is Judge Judy is not about justice, but entertainment. Nevertheless, Judge Judy must conform at some level with regular laws. And so these would be like the codified laws of any society, right? And so these are akin to thing because the laws are the things which most directly affect us. So, speed limits and all that kind of stuff, whatever. Those are the sort of thing level that drive the concept of justice for most people in a day-to-day life. Which is why things like Judge Judy are sort of images of the thing, if that makes sense. So Judge Judy is a shadowy reflection based on law, but these laws are chosen by individuals, right, puppeteers, and they are reflected to us. So then the next question is, well, where do these laws come from? Well, they themselves come from somewhere. And where I would argue that laws, and if you think of it, every law in the United States has to jive with something. And what that thing that it must somehow relate to is the U.S. Constitution, right? And so the Constitution is a document that houses and states as best that it can the concept of justice that came from a certain moment in time. Well, it did come from a moment in time, but it's also attempting to be universal. So let me just finish this out first and say that the Constitution, and literally where did the Constitution come from? Well, I mean, as you know, it's a piece of paper. You can read it, we the people and all that stuff, right? But the Constitution came from the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention. And what was that? That was a conference in 1789 in Philadelphia where all the founders got together and they debated what is justice. That was the question. And in trying to understand justice, they are trying to understand justice itself. Well, as you can imagine, you get a group full of people, throw them in a room and say, you figure out what justice is, you're going to get all kinds of different answers. And indeed, if you read Madison's account of the Constitutional Convention, it is all over the place. And you have different representatives from different parts of the country with totally different understandings of what is just. So both Washington and Madison said that the fact that they ever came up with an agreement, let alone ratified it, was a miracle. Because what the founders are doing is they're debating the concept of justice itself. So what they're after basically is form. Well, it turns out you can't really define a form. And so the Constitution is an image of the debate and compromise that happened here. So the Constitution is like the sort of crusty rind on the residue of the discussion of what is just. But this one, the form, you'll never fully articulate. But, you can come up with a pretty darn good image of the thing in itself. So the Constitution is like an image of justice, which is why it's not complete. I mean, no human person, no human body of people can ever, have a complete understanding of justice because we are human, we're limited. Nevertheless, though, that concept of justice is one that forms a fundamental ground for all the other laws that people use to function in a day-to-day kind of existence. We don't really use the Constitution daily unless we're, constitutional lawyers or something. And then ultimately these laws that have to jive somehow with the Constitution are then, fed to the public in a dumbed down entertainment version of things like Judge Judy, or you could think of, various other law shows and stuff like that. Most people don't really read laws. Very few people read the Constitution. And even fewer people still understand the complex nature of justice itself. But according to the cave metaphor, this is the whole thing, to move through these various levels of justice. Of anything, but in this case, using an example, justice. And you could think of this with anything. Take a tree, right? Here you could have a picture of a tree. Here you could have the actual physical tree. Here you might have an artist's depiction of a tree. And here you would have the idea that the creator of the universe had in mind when he, she, it, whatever, created tree in the first place. Here would be a picture of a cat. Here would be a physical cat. Here would be a biologist's understanding of a cat. And again, here would be the cat in itself without any opinions of it that a biologist or veterinarian or cat artist or cat lover might come up with. Now, in what we'll see next in the divided line, these have different names. The lowest level is called Ecasia. And Ecasia essentially means like image sort of thing. And then level 2 is called Pistis, which means essentially belief. And then Dionia is the third level, which is thought, sort of. And then the highest level is what is called noesis, or understanding. So number 4 is noesis, number 1 is icasia, and number 2 and 3 are Dionia and Pistis. And I bring this up because our next video, or whatever you call these things, is going to be on book 6 in the divided line, which begins around line, 509D. 509D. So let's say this is the conclusion of the, the outline of the cave metaphor. Now the next thing is how do you interpret it, and there's still a lot more to be read. In this section he talks about things like the nature of education and stuff, so we'll still play around with that. It's just not going to be on one of these sort of video things. But please look now at the next piece in this segment called the divided line.